Hello, it's Nim Game again, everyone. Throughout all that time, the player has wandered through every level of the factory and caused all kinds of chaos. From messing with the factory's security guard and destroying transportation equipment to pushing the pink spider lady into a giant grinder. Mindlessly picking flowers, and playing with electricity despite the teacher's warnings. After that, the player continued causing the deaths of many creatures, including both enemies and allies. I am not exactly sure how much time has passed inside the Playtime Company factory. But even if we assume that each chapter takes place over the course of one day, the player has still completely turned this bizarre toy factory upside down. And yet, the final boss, the prototype, still has not killed us. If I were him, I would have gathered everyone together and dealt with the player immediately. But if that had happened from the beginning, we would not have had a game to play together for all these years. Everything began when the player received an anonymous letter claiming that some of the factory's employees were still alive. Yes, that letter was the powerful motivation that drove the player to return to his former workplace, allowing us to control him again and again. So who wrote that letter? And what was their true purpose? Today, let's think about it together and try to uncover the answer. But first, press the like button below so Nim Game will have more motivation to make more entertaining videos for you. Now, let's return to the very beginning. If you have played through several chapters, you probably still remember the "find the flower" letter that led the player back to the factory. This detail contains several important clues and marks the beginning of the entire chain of events inside Playtime Co. By examining the letter, we can identify a few clues. First of all, it does not really look like a proper letter. There is no greeting, no signature, and no name. Everything about it is extremely simple. The letters are uneven and jumbled together, and the message even contains spelling mistakes. The handwriting is messy and accompanied by several drawings. This suggests that the writer may have been a child or a toy that was once a child. An ordinary adult would probably never write a letter that looked like this. Among all the toys we encounter inside the factory, there are many different kinds. However, very few of the monsters have hands, feet, and the ability to draw. Among the many theories that have been proposed, some people believe that a smiling critter named Crafty Corn wrote the letter because she has an almost obsessive love for the color red. Much like how some of us become completely obsessed with a certain team every summer. It is perfectly understandable if you have forgotten this character. After all, she has never appeared as a real monster in any of the 4 chapters. She has only been introduced through stories and merchandise related to the smiling critters. Crafty Corn is an anthropomorphic unicorn with white skin, black eyes, horse-like ears, and a spiraling silver horn growing from the center of her forehead. Her hooves, mane, and tail are light blue, matching the insides of her ears. Crafty Corn is a creative unicorn with a deep passion for art. She shares the importance of creativity with the other members of the group and sees beauty in everything around her. In the animated introduction, Crafty Corn demonstrates that she is a talented artist. The idea that Crafty Corn loves the color red was actually inferred from the dialogue heard when interacting with her cardboard cutout. There is also a theory that Crafty Corn was the one who painted the enormous poppy flower on the hallway floor in Chapter 1. However, this theory has received mixed reactions since it was first proposed. If Crafty Corn really wrote the letter, why would she want the player to return to the factory? Everything we currently know about her is that she was simply one of the smiling critters. Even if she played some role in the Bigger Bodies initiative, she still does not appear important enough to be a major character in the game. It would be rather strange for a game with such carefully connected storytelling as Poppy Playtime to introduce an entirely separate character whose only purpose was to write one letter. In Chapter 3, when we find Dog Day imprisoned, he tells us that he is the last surviving smiling critter. Combined with the drawings on the walls of Safe Haven and the information revealed in Chapter 3 about the Hour of Joy, it appears that the entire Smiling Critters group was torn apart, eaten, or killed. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that Crafty Corn wrote the letter. Even if she somehow did write it, she probably would not have been capable of delivering it to the player outside the factory. Another toy that appears to enjoy drawing is Kissy Missy. Kissy Missy is extremely friendly and always seems gentle. She also appears to enjoy drawing and often tries to help others. However, for the same reason, I believe her mind has remained trapped in the past for the last 10 years. And she may never have left the factory. It is possible that Kissy Missy wrote the letter. But writing the letter is one thing. Delivering it directly to the player is another matter entirely. And that would be far beyond the abilities of an ordinary toy. So who else could have written it? Let's move on to a more likely candidate, Poppy. The most mysterious and emotionally complex character inside the Playtime Company factory may not be the prototype. It may actually be the small Poppy doll. Although the prototype is the main villain, his goal of ruling the factory is relatively clear. Poppy's true objective, however, remains uncertain. She wants to escape from the factory. Yet she is also determined to destroy the prototype, even if she must die with him. She wants to live as a real human being. Yet she also agreed to take part in a plan to overthrow humanity. Do these contradictions not make Poppy's rebellious intentions even more obvious? There is another important detail. The message, "Find the flower." Could it truly be a coincidence that Poppy's room is decorated with an enormous flower and that Poppy herself is named after a flower? Therefore, it is entirely possible that even though the doll could not physically escape from her glass case, she remained conscious, capable of thinking, and somehow managed to prepare a letter for the player so that he would come and free her. That sounds reasonable, but it is not entirely convincing. The player was previously an employee at Playtime Co. He should therefore have known about Poppy and possibly even the events surrounding the Hour of Joy. Likewise, if Poppy had written a letter asking someone to rescue her, she would surely have known the identity of the person she was contacting. However, when Poppy sees the player demonstrate his abilities, she appears genuinely surprised. She then decides that she wants to involve him in her much larger plans. Does that not suggest that Poppy had no prior knowledge of the player's existence? After playing through several chapters, you have probably started forming an idea about the player's true identity. He was a former employee of the factory, but he was probably not a low-ranking worker. The grab pack and the methods required to operate it were restricted experimental technology. Only certain specialists would have been allowed to access or use it. Therefore, the player was probably not an ordinary toy production worker. He must have been connected in some way to the Bigger Bodies initiative. The clearest evidence is that both Mommy Longlegs and Miss Delight appear to recognize him. This strongly suggests that the player was involved, at least to some degree, in the events that took place inside the factory. Do you remember the VHS recording that plays during the hallucination sequence in Home Sweet Home? A reversed voice on the radio tells us, "You were supposed to be there." It sounds as though we missed an extremely important event. Perhaps the player was an employee who was supposed to participate in the Hour of Joy but fled at the last moment or was prevented from attending. Alternatively, he may have been one of the company's accomplices who quickly escaped after realizing that something terrible was about to happen. Remember that Playtime Company officially shut down as soon as the Hour of Joy began. However, the factory never truly stopped operating. The clearest evidence is that resource extraction teams continued being sent into the factory to recover materials, rebuild certain areas, and resume research and toy production activities. This is the setting of Project Playtime. And who ordered those teams to enter the factory? The factory's director, Leith Pierre. He is one of the people most heavily involved in the events at Playtime Company, and he may have had the strongest motive to send the letter. First, bringing people back into the factory was something Pierre had already been doing for a long time. Finding a former employee with the skills and experience of the player would therefore make perfect sense. The message, "Find the flower," initially seems vague, but with the intelligence and experience of an adult, the player would immediately understand that the flower referred to Poppy, a talking and highly intelligent doll who, most importantly, could help him fight against the prototype. Such a subtle message would provide enough of a clue while remaining difficult for the prototype to detect and intercept. Therefore, another theory is that Leith Pierre wrote the letter. But what motive would he have had? Throughout the game, Leith Pierre's name appears almost everywhere, but only through documents, recordings, and instructional videos. We still have no idea what happened to the factory's director. However, one thing appears certain. The factory's systems are currently under the control of Harley Sawyer, the scientist who was transformed by Playtime Company from a human researcher into a heartless machine. Therefore, Leith Pierre may have attempted to use an outsider like the player to bypass the prototype's internal systems and security. One detail supporting this theory is that Leith Pierre disappeared from the company's records and was no longer mentioned after the experiments began spiraling out of control. However, there is still one problem. Why would an educated executive like Pierre create a letter filled with childish drawings, spelling mistakes, and grammatical errors? A highly educated manager like Leith Pierre would naturally have a very different writing style. Therefore, this theory also contains several inconsistencies. That brings us to one final possibility. The prototype himself may have been behind the letter. This theory is actually very easy to explain. The prototype controls countless followers. Some of them are known to us, while others remain hidden. He could easily have forced one of the toys to write the letter and send it outside. Remember that some of these toys were once children. Their minds may not have developed any further after all those years, which would explain the genuine spelling mistakes and childish handwriting. Appealing to the player's sympathy and convincing him to return to rescue the children would make perfect sense. Most of the toys who followed the prototype were once children filled with hatred toward Playtime Co.'s employees and the Bigger Bodies initiative. Perhaps the letter was simply bait used by the prototype to lure the player back into the factory so that he could take revenge. But revenge against whom? Possibly against the player himself. This would be consistent with the prototype's goal of punishing every cruel employee who tortured children and transformed them into monsters. In Chapter 3, we receive a very clear hint about the player's guilt, suggesting that he once worked directly with children involved in the Bigger Bodies initiative. If the player participated in the project as a researcher or someone directly responsible for the experiments, it would make complete sense for him to become one of the prototype's targets. But there may be something more. There is another interesting theory. The prototype is using this to eliminate the older toys, including Mommy Long Legs, Huggy Wuggy, and even Catnap, allowing him to collect their body parts afterward. Experiment 1006 is a strange and unique specimen, far more extraordinary than the other toys. He is not merely another living toy. He is an exceptionally successful experimental subject. We know that he can collect different parts and use them to improve his own body. He is also capable of learning and adapting extremely quickly. Human greed has no limit. However, if the ruler of the factory personally killed his own followers just to steal their arms and legs, he would lose the respect of everyone beneath him. Instead, he could summon an incredibly persistent human, give that person a grab pack, and allow him to eliminate every troublesome follower. Once the player had finished doing all the work, the prototype could simply kill him afterward. That would save time while also preventing the prototype from being seen as someone who betrayed his own allies. This motive is quite convincing, but there is another theory that may be even more mind-blowing. What if the player himself is exactly what the prototype needs? Would it be too insane to suggest that the player is also a bigger body? Every time we die and reach the death screen, the television loses its signal and displays a series of strange messages, such as, "Get up," "Go," or, "This is only the beginning." It sounds as though someone is encouraging us every time we fail, just as the souls of children continue living inside the toys. The player may be capable of dying and then being restored in an entirely new body. If the player is a bigger body, then every death and resurrection throughout the game would suddenly make sense. The player really does die. He really does have his head bitten off by Huggy Wuggy. But his consciousness and soul may simply be transferred into another body. Based on all these clues, it seems highly likely that the prototype was the one who sent the letter to the player. What do you think? Does my theory sound convincing? Or is there another important detail that we have overlooked? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening, and do not forget to subscribe to Nim Game. Feel free to leave a comment so I can research it and bring you even more mind-blowing theories. For now, I will see you in the next episode.